The rain pattered against the windshield of Officer James Sullivan's patrol car as he watched the steady stream of vehicles passing through the dimly lit streets of Washington, D.C. It was just another Friday night shift, or so he thought. Fresh out of the police academy with only 8 months on the force, Sullivan took pride in doing everything by the book. At precisely 10:45 p.m., his radar gun caught a black Mercedes S-Class sedan speeding at 68 miles per hour in a 45 miles per hour zone. Without hesitation, Sullivan flipped on his patrol car's lights and sirens, pulling out to pursue the luxury vehicle. The Mercedes continued for several seconds before finally slowing down and pulling over to the curb on a quiet, tree-lined street. Sullivan called in the stop to dispatch, reading out the license plate number as he approached the vehicle. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, setting off the first warning bells in his mind. Following protocol, he touched the trunk lightly as he walked past, a habit drilled into every officer during training to leave fingerprints in case something went wrong. The young officer's hand rested on his holstered weapon, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he approached the driver's side window. Before he could reach it, the rear passenger door suddenly swung open. Sullivan's heart rate spiked, and his training kicked in immediately. "Stay in the vehicle," he shouted, taking 2 quick steps backward. "Sir, return to your vehicle immediately." But the passenger was already emerging, a tall, well-dressed black man in an expensive suit. Sullivan could make out a leather briefcase in one hand, while the other reached inside his jacket. In that split second, everything Sullivan had learned about officer safety flooded his mind. "Hands where I can see them," Sullivan commanded, drawing his weapon and pointing it at the man. "On the ground, now." "Officer, I'm the Attorney General of the United States," the man said calmly, trying to retrieve something from his jacket pocket. "If you'll just let me show you my credentials." "On the ground now," Sullivan repeated more forcefully, his adrenaline pumping. The rain was coming down harder now, and water dripped from the barrel of his service weapon. "Face down, hands behind your head." The man's driver had started to exit the vehicle as well, but Sullivan's sharp command forced him back inside. Reluctantly, the well-dressed passenger lowered himself to the wet pavement, his expensive suit soaking up the rainwater as he lay face down on the ground. Sullivan's radio crackled with dispatch asking for a status update. With one hand still training his weapon on the prone figure, he carried his shoulder mic. "Dispatch, I need backup at my location. I have 1 subject on the ground, 2nd subject in the vehicle." Within minutes, the quiet street erupted with the sounds of multiple sirens as backup units raced to the scene. At the same time, 2 black SUVs came screaming around the corner from the opposite direction, their occupants quickly emerging with weapons drawn. "Secret Service. Lower your weapon, officer." Sullivan's world spun as he realized what was happening. The man he had forced to lie in the rain was indeed Attorney General Robert Wilson, one of the highest-ranking officials in the U.S. government. The Secret Service agents quickly helped Wilson to his feet, while other officers pulled Sullivan aside. The young officer's face burned with embarrassment and fear as he watched Wilson's soaked suit drip onto the pavement. The Attorney General's normally immaculate appearance was now disheveled, his face a mask of controlled anger as he brushed off his ruined clothes. Sullivan's supervisor arrived moments later, immediately pulling him aside while profusely apologizing to Wilson and his security detail. The young officer could only watch in stunned silence as the magnitude of his mistake began to sink in. He had just held the Attorney General of the United States at gunpoint and forced him to lie in a puddle, all because of a simple speeding violation. As Wilson and his entourage prepared to leave, the Attorney General's eyes met Sullivan's for a brief moment. There was something in that look that made Sullivan's blood run cold, not anger or threat, but a calculated assessment that seemed to say, "This isn't over." Standing in the rain long after the Mercedes and its escort had departed, Officer James Sullivan knew his life was about to change dramatically. He just didn't know how much. The following morning, Officer James Sullivan sat in Chief Morgan's office, his uniform perfectly pressed despite having barely slept. The morning news was playing silently on a wall-mounted TV, showing footage from last night's incident. Someone had recorded it on their phone, and now the video was everywhere. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Chief Morgan's voice was surprisingly calm as he paced behind his desk. "The Attorney General of the United States, Sullivan, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country, and you made him lie face down in a puddle." Sullivan stared at his hands, folded in his lap. Sir, he exited the vehicle suddenly and reached inside his jacket. I followed protocol. Protocol? The chief stopped pacing. His security detail was right behind him. Did you think the Secret Service would be escorting a dangerous criminal? Before Sullivan could respond, there was a knock at the door. A secretary poked her head in, looking nervous. Sir, the Attorney General's office is on line 1. The room fell silent as Chief Morgan picked up the phone. Sullivan could feel sweat forming on his forehead as he watched his superior's expression change from concern to surprise. Yes, sir. Yes, he's here with me now. The chief looked at Sullivan. I understand. We'll be there in 30 minutes. Hanging up the phone, Chief Morgan grabbed his coat. Get up, Sullivan. The Attorney General wants to see us both. Now. The drive to the Department of Justice was the longest 20 minutes of Sullivan's life. He kept replaying the previous night in his head, wondering if he should have noticed the government plates on the Mercedes, if he should have recognized Wilson's face from TV. But everything had happened so fast. When they arrived, they were led through security and up to the Attorney General's office on the 5th floor. Wilson was standing at his window, wearing a fresh suit and looking out over the city. He turned as they entered, and Sullivan was struck by how much more imposing he seemed in his own domain. Officer Sullivan, Wilson said, his deep voice filling the room. Please have a seat. Sullivan sat stiffly in one of the leather chairs facing Wilson's desk. Chief Morgan took the other, while Wilson remained standing. Do you know why I asked you here? Wilson asked, looking directly at Sullivan. To terminate my employment, sir? Sullivan's voice was barely a whisper. To his surprise, Wilson laughed. No, Officer Sullivan, I called you here because last night was a perfect example of everything that's wrong with our current system, and everything that could be right about it. Wilson walked around his desk and leaned against it, closer to Sullivan. You were doing your job. You followed your training. The problem isn't you, it's the training itself. Sullivan blinked in confusion as Wilson continued. Every year, hundreds of similar incidents occur across this country. Some end peacefully, like last night. Others end in tragedy. The only difference is often just luck. Walking to a side table, Wilson poured 3 cups of coffee and handed them out. I've been working on a comprehensive police reform bill, but last night showed me what's missing, the perspective of officers on the ground, dealing with split-second decisions. Chief Morgan shifted in his chair. Sir, I'm not sure I follow. I'm offering Officer Sullivan a chance to be part of something important, Wilson said. Instead of punishing him, I want him to help us develop better protocols for high-risk encounters, to turn this incident into a teaching moment for departments across the country. Sullivan's mouth went dry. Me, sir? Yes, you. Wilson sat behind his desk. You made a mistake last night, but you also showed strict adherence to protocol and remarkable restraint once the situation was clear. Those are qualities we need. Looking at the young officer's stunned expression, Wilson smiled slightly. Unless, of course, you prefer I file a formal complaint. No, sir. Sullivan sat up straighter. I mean, I would be honored to help. Good. Wilson opened a folder on his desk. Because we start tomorrow. I've already cleared it with your department. You'll be temporarily assigned to my task force while maintaining your regular duties. As Sullivan and Chief Morgan left the Attorney General's office that morning, the young officer felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. What had started as the worst mistake of his career had somehow turned into an opportunity he never could have imagined. But as he would soon learn, this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Officer James Sullivan. By day, he continued his regular patrol duties, but his afternoons were spent at the Department of Justice, working with Attorney General Wilson's task force on police reform. The contrast between his two worlds couldn't have been more striking. One particular Wednesday afternoon, Sullivan sat in a large conference room, surrounded by senior law enforcement officials, civil rights lawyers, and policy experts. He felt out of place in his uniform among their expensive suits, but Wilson had insisted he wear it. Officer Sullivan, Wilson called out, drawing everyone's attention. Tell them about last Friday's incident on your beat. Sullivan cleared his throat nervously. Just 5 days ago, he'd encountered a situation similar to his famous mistake. A black SUV with tinted windows had run a red light, and when he pulled it over, the passenger had started to exit the vehicle. Instead of drawing my weapon, Sullivan explained, I used the PA system to give clear instructions. I identified myself and asked them to remain in the vehicle while keeping my distance. It turned out to be a state senator who was running late for a meeting. Wilson nodded approvingly. And how did that make you feel, compared to our encounter? In control, sir, Sullivan answered honestly. By maintaining distance and using the PA system, I had time to assess the situation. The senator heard my instructions clearly, and everyone stayed calm. The room buzzed with discussion as people took notes. Sullivan's real-world experiences were proving invaluable to the task force's work, but not everyone was happy about his involvement. During a break, Sullivan overheard two senior officers talking near the coffee machine. Can't believe Wilson's letting this rookie tell us how to do our jobs, one muttered. Kid gets lucky pointing his gun at the edge, and now he's some kind of expert. Sullivan's face burned, but before he could walk away, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Wilson. Gentlemen, the Attorney General's voice carried across the room. Officer Sullivan isn't here because he made a mistake. He's here because he had the courage to learn from it. How many of us can say the same? The officers quickly dispersed, but the incident left Sullivan shaken. Later that afternoon, Wilson called him into his private office. Don't let them get to you, Wilson said, pouring them both coffee. Change is hard, especially for those who've been doing things the same way for decades. Sullivan stared into his coffee cup. Sir, may I ask you something personal? Go ahead. That night, when I had you on the ground, why didn't you fight back? You could have had me fired, or worse. Wilson was quiet for a long moment. Because, Officer Sullivan, that night showed me something important. You weren't a bad cop. You were a good cop following bad protocols. And that's much more dangerous. He walked to his window, looking out at the city. Every day, good officers make split-second decisions based on training that hasn't kept up with the times. Some of those decisions end in tragedy, but you gave me an opportunity to change that. Sullivan nodded slowly, beginning to understand. This wasn't just about him, or even about Wilson. It was about transforming a system that had failed them both that rainy night. As if reading his thoughts, Wilson turned back to him. Next week, we're taking our show on the road. Police departments in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York have requested presentations on our new protocols. I want you to lead those sessions. Sullivan nearly choked on his coffee. Me, sir? But I'm just a patrol officer. Exactly, Wilson smiled. You're the one they'll listen to. You've been where they are. And more importantly, you've learned what they need to learn. As Sullivan left the office that evening, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The mistake that he thought would end his career had instead given him a chance to prevent others from making the same error. But as he would soon discover, taking their message nationwide would bring challenges none of them had anticipated. Walking to his car, Sullivan couldn't shake the feeling that the real test of their work was still to come. He had no idea how right he was. The Chicago Police Academy's main auditorium was packed with officers of all ranks. Sullivan stood backstage, adjusting his uniform nervously while Attorney General Wilson reviewed their presentation notes. This was their first stop on the nationwide tour, and everything had to be perfect. Remember, Wilson said, placing a reassuring hand on Sullivan's shoulder, they're not here to judge you. They're here to learn from you. But as Sullivan stepped onto the stage, the hostile energy in the room was unmistakable. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him, many belonging to officers who had seen the viral video of his encounter with Wilson. Some wore smirks, others looked openly dismissive. My name is Officer James Sullivan, he began, his voice shaking slightly. And 3 months ago, I made a mistake that could have ended in tragedy. As he recounted the story of that rainy night, Sullivan noticed something changing in the audience. The smirks began to fade. When he described the moment, he realized who he had ordered to the ground. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But I'm not here to talk about my mistake, Sullivan continued, gaining confidence. I'm here to talk about the system that made that mistake almost inevitable. Just then, a voice called out from the middle of the auditorium. So we're supposed to just let suspects jump out of their vehicles now? The speaker, a veteran sergeant, stood up. Maybe we should hand them our guns while we're at it. Before Wilson could intervene, Sullivan responded. 3 weeks ago, I got a call about an armed robbery. The suspect's description matched a man I saw running down Monroe Street. When I approached him, he reached into his jacket, just like the Attorney General did that night. The room went silent. But this time, I used our new protocols. I maintained distance, used clear verbal commands through the PA system, and positioned my vehicle for cover. Turns out, he was reaching for his phone to show me he was actually an undercover detective pursuing the real suspect. Sullivan paused, letting the implication sink in. The old protocols would have had me draw my weapon immediately. The new ones gave me time to assess the situation. They didn't make me less safe, they made everyone safer. As the presentation continued, more officers began asking genuine questions. They shared their own stories of close calls and split-second decisions. What had started as hostility was transforming into real dialogue. During the lunch break, the sergeant who had challenged Sullivan approached him. "Got a minute, kid?" he asked, looking slightly embarrassed. "That scenario you described, the undercover detective. Something similar happened to me last year, but it didn't end as well. Officer got shot, suspect got shot. It was a mess." Sullivan listened as the veteran officer opened up about his experiences. By the end of the day, several other officers had shared similar stories. The presentation had touched a nerve, revealing how many of them had struggled with the limitations of their training. That evening, as Sullivan and Wilson reviewed the day's events in their hotel room, Wilson seemed pleased. "You did well today," he said. "You turned their hostility into understanding. That's not easy." Sullivan nodded, but something was bothering him. "Sir, what about the officers who aren't in these presentations? The ones who think we're trying to make their jobs harder or more dangerous?" Wilson's expression grew serious. "That's why we're not just doing presentations. Next month, we start Phase 2, actual field training with body cameras to document real-world applications of the new protocols. And you think departments will agree to that?" "They'll have to," Wilson replied, "because I'm making it a condition for federal funding." As Sullivan processed this information, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Opening it, his heart sank. The headline read, "Police union leaders denounce AB's reform program as dangerous political stunt." Wilson saw his expression and smiled grimly. "Did you think this would be easy? Real change never is. But tomorrow, we do it all again in Los Angeles. And we keep going until we get it right." Looking out the hotel window at the Chicago skyline, Sullivan realized that their real battle was just beginning. The question was, were they ready for what came next? 2 months after the Chicago presentation, Sullivan found himself back in Washington, D.C., but under very different circumstances. The nationwide tour had been temporarily suspended following a series of highly publicized police union protests. Now, he sat in a crowded congressional hearing room, waiting to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Attorney General Wilson had warned him this would happen. The pushback against their reform program had grown too loud to ignore, and now politicians wanted answers. Sullivan tugged at his collar, watching as Wilson finished his opening statement to the committee. "And now," the committee chairman announced, "we'll hear from Officer James Sullivan, the officer whose encounter with Attorney General Wilson sparked this controversial program." As Sullivan approached the microphone, camera flashes lit up the room. You could see the police union representatives sitting in the back, their faces stern and disapproving. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Distinguished committee members, I'm not here as an expert on police reform. I'm here as an officer who learned the hard way that our current system needs change." Just then, Senator Matthews, a vocal critic of the program, interrupted. "Officer Sullivan, isn't it true that your new protocols would add dangerous delays to police response times?" "No, sir," Sullivan replied firmly. "Last month in Los Angeles, we documented over 200 traffic stops using our new protocols. Average response time increased by only 3 seconds, while successful peaceful resolutions increased by 40%. The senator leaned forward. "And what about officer safety? We have testimony from multiple police unions claiming these protocols put officers at greater risk." Sullivan had anticipated this question. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. 2 weeks ago, I received this video from an officer in Chicago who used our new protocols during a traffic stop. With your permission, I'd like to play it." The chairman nodded, and the video began playing through the room's speakers. It showed a tense situation where a driver suddenly exited his vehicle during a stop. Instead of immediate escalation, the officer used the new protocols, maintaining distance, using clear PA system commands, and properly positioning his patrol car. The situation was resolved peacefully when it turned out the driver was having a medical emergency. That officer later told me that under the old protocols, he would have drawn his weapon immediately, Sullivan explained. Instead, he saved a man's life. The room fell silent. Even the union representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. During a break in the hearing, Sullivan stepped into the hallway for water. He was surprised to find one of the union leaders waiting for him. "You made some good points in there, Sullivan," the man said grudgingly. "But you have to understand, we can't support changes that might get our officers killed." Sullivan nodded. "I understand. That's why we're inviting union representatives to help us refine these protocols. We need your experience to make them work." The union leader looked surprised. This was the first he heard of such an invitation. When the hearing resumed, Sullivan had one final statement to make. "Members of the committee, 3 months ago I held a gun on the Attorney General of the United States because I was following protocols that left no room for judgment or de-escalation. Today, I'm asking for your support to ensure that no other officer has to make that same mistake." To everyone's surprise, Senator Matthews spoke up again. "Officer Sullivan, while I still have concerns about this program, your testimony today has been enlightening. Perhaps there's room for compromise." As the hearing concluded, Wilson approached Sullivan with a slight smile. "You did well in there, but now comes the hard part." "What's that, sir?" "Making it work in the real world. The committee seems willing to support us, and even the unions are showing interest. Now we have to prove that these changes can work everywhere, not just in controlled demonstrations." Sullivan understood the challenge ahead. They had won an important battle today, but the war for meaningful reform was far from over. As they left the hearing room, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions. Wilson turned to Sullivan. "Ready for Phase 3? Sullivan nodded, remembering how far they'd come from that rainy night. "Ready, sir." "What's next?" Walking through the Capitol corridors, Wilson began outlining their next steps. Neither man could have predicted how their story would continue to unfold, or how their unlikely partnership would soon face its greatest test yet. Phase 3 of the reform program launched on a crisp autumn morning in Detroit, the first city to fully implement the new protocols across its entire police force. Sullivan stood with Attorney General Wilson in the department's command center, watching live feeds from officer body cameras as the new system faced its first real test. "Nervous?" Wilson asked, noting Sullivan's tense posture. "A little," Sullivan admitted. "Everything we've worked for comes down to how this plays out on the streets." The command center buzzed with activity as dispatchers coordinated with officers using the new protocols. Police union representatives sat alongside them, carefully monitoring each interaction. They had insisted on being part of the observation team, and Wilson had welcomed their involvement. Around noon, the first major test came. A call crackled over the radio about an armed suspect near a downtown bank. Officer Sarah Chen, one of the first trained in the new protocols, responded to the scene. Everyone in the command center watched Chen's body camera feed as she approached the situation. Following the new guidelines, she established a safe distance, used her PA system for clear communications, and positioned her vehicle to provide cover. The suspect, clearly agitated, kept reaching toward his waistband. Under the old protocols, this would have led to immediate weapon deployment. Instead, Chen maintained her distance and used de-escalation techniques they had developed. "Show me your hands slowly," Chen's calm voice came through the speakers. "I'm here to help if you need it, but I need to ensure everyone's safety first." Sullivan held his breath as the situation unfolded. After tense moments, the suspect slowly raised his hands, revealing not a weapon, but an insulin pump. He was having a diabetic episode. "That's exactly how it's supposed to work," Sullivan said quietly as medical help was called to the scene. The union representative watching nearby nodded grudgingly. "I'll admit, that was well handled." But not everything went smoothly that day. Later in the afternoon, a rookie officer reverted to old habits during a traffic stop, creating a tense situation that required supervisor intervention. Sullivan and Wilson immediately used the incident as a teaching opportunity, gathering officers to review what could have been done differently. As the day progressed, a local news crew arrived to cover the program's implementation. The reporter asked Sullivan for his thoughts. "What we're seeing today proves that change is possible," he explained. "These protocols aren't just about avoiding confrontation, they're about making better decisions in critical moments." Wilson added, "Officer Sullivan's experience showed us the problem. Today, Detroit is showing us the solution." Just then, multiple calls came in about a developing situation at a shopping mall. Reports of shots fired sent every available unit racing to the scene. The command center fell silent as they watched the response unfold. The new protocols faced their ultimate test as officers arrived at the chaotic scene. Using their training, they established clear zones of control, maintained professional distance, and coordinated their responses through the new communication systems. What could have become a devastating tragedy instead ended with the peaceful arrest of a teenager with a replica gun. No shots were fired, no lives were lost. Later that evening, as Sullivan and Wilson reviewed the day's events, the chief of Detroit Police joined them. "I've seen enough," the chief said. "We're keeping these protocols. My officers feel more confident, and more importantly, they're safer." Wilson smiled. "And the union representatives?" "They're drafting a statement of support right now," the chief replied. "They want to know when we can start training other departments." Sullivan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. After months of development, testing, and refinement, their program had proved itself where it mattered most, on the streets. "We're not done yet," Wilson reminded them. "Detroit is just the beginning. We need to prove this can work anywhere." Sullivan nodded, remembering how far they'd come from that rainy night when he'd made the biggest mistake of his career. That mistake had led to changes that were now saving lives. As they prepared to leave the command center, a young officer stopped Sullivan. "Sir," she said, "I used to think you were the officer who messed up with the Attorney General. Now I understand. You're the officer who helped us all do better." Walking out into the Detroit night, Sullivan realized that their story had evolved into something much bigger than just two men's encounter on a rainy street. It had become a blueprint for change, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove it could work. 6 months after Detroit's successful implementation, Sullivan found himself standing before a very different audience. The United Nations had invited Attorney General Wilson to present their police reform program to an international delegation, and Wilson had insisted that Sullivan take the lead. "Representatives from 28 countries are here today," Wilson whispered as they prepared to enter the conference hall. "Our program isn't just changing American policing anymore. It's going global." Sullivan straightened his uniform, now adorned with a special commendation pin from the Department of Justice. As he walked to the podium, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. The Chicago sergeant who had initially opposed them, the Detroit chief of police, and several union representatives who had become strong supporters. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan began, his voice steady and confident now after countless presentations. "A year ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it started a revolution in police training." As he spoke, screens behind him showed statistics from cities that had adopted their protocols. Successful de-escalations were up 70%, use of force incidents down 45%, and officer injuries had decreased by 30%. But it was the next set of numbers that drew gasps from the audience. "In the past 3 months alone," Sullivan continued, "our protocols have prevented 147 potentially lethal encounters. That's 147 lives saved, both civilians and officers." During the presentation, Sullivan shared body camera footage from various successful interventions. Each clip showed officers using the new protocols to defuse situations that, under the old system, might have ended tragically. Suddenly, Sullivan's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He glanced at it quickly, then looked at Wilson, who nodded. Something big was happening back home. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," Sullivan said, "we're about to witness a live demonstration of these protocols in action." He connected his phone to the main screen, showing a live feed from Washington, D.C., where a hostage situation was unfolding at a bank. The responding officers were all trained in their new protocols. The international audience watched in real time as the officers handled the crisis. Their coordinated response, Clear communication and strategic positioning created a controlled environment that gave the hostage taker a chance to surrender peacefully, which he did after 2 hours of negotiation. When the situation was resolved, the room erupted in applause. Representatives from multiple countries immediately approached Wilson about implementing the program in their nations. During the lunch break, Sullivan found himself sitting with police officials from the United Kingdom, Japan, and Brazil, all eager to learn more. The Chicago surgeon joined them, adding his perspective on how the protocols had transformed his department. "You know what the best part is?" the surgeon said to the group. "Our younger officers don't even think about it anymore. These protocols are just natural to them now." Later that afternoon, Wilson pulled Sullivan aside with unexpected news. "The president is establishing a new federal bureau for police reform," Wilson announced. "He wants me to head it, and I want you as my deputy director." Sullivan was stunned. "Sir, I'm just a patrol officer." "Not anymore," Wilson smiled. "You're the face of police reform, Sullivan. Your mistake and our partnership showed everyone that change is possible. Now we have the chance to make it permanent." As Sullivan considered the offer, his phone lit up with messages from officers around the country. They were sending him videos of successful interventions using the protocols he had helped develop. Each one represented a potential tragedy transformed into a peaceful resolution. "One condition," Sullivan said finally. "I want to keep working directly with officers on the street. We can't lose touch with the real world while sitting behind desks in Washington." Wilson nodded approvingly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the UN conference concluded, Sullivan looked out at the international gathering of law enforcement officials. The program that had started with his mistake was now poised to change policing practices worldwide. Walking out of the UN building that evening, Sullivan remembered the rain-soaked night when he had held his gun on the Attorney General. That moment of crisis had led to transformation, not just for him, but for the entire law enforcement community. But as he would soon learn, the greatest challenge still lay ahead. The true test of their reforms would come when they least expected it, and in a way that would push their partnership to its limits. 3 years after that fateful rainy night, Officer James Sullivan, now Deputy Director Sullivan, stood beside Attorney General Wilson at the National Law Enforcement Memorial in Washington, D.C. They were there to unveil a new edition, a wall dedicated to situations where their reformed protocols had saved lives. The ceremony was packed with officers, politicians, and media from around the world. But Sullivan's attention was drawn to a small group of people in the front row, families whose loved ones had been saved by the new protocols. When Officer Sullivan pointed his gun at me that night, Wilson began his speech. "Neither of us could have imagined we'd be standing here today. What began as a mistake has become the foundation for the most significant reform in law enforcement history." Just then, Sullivan's phone buzzed with an urgent alert. A situation was developing at a high school just blocks away. An armed student had been reported on campus. Sullivan showed the message to Wilson, who nodded grimly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wilson announced, "you're about to witness our protocols in action. Please stay calm and remain here." Sullivan and Wilson rushed to their vehicle, heading to the scene. As they arrived, they found officers already implementing the new protocols, establishing safe distances, using clear communications, and positioning themselves strategically. The officer in charge was Sarah Chen, the same officer who had handled the diabetic emergency in Detroit years ago. She had since become one of their most effective trainers. "The student is in the library," Chen reported. "He's scared and confused, but no shots have been fired. We're using the new youth crisis protocols." Sullivan watched as Chen's team handled the situation exactly as they had trained. Through their body camera feeds, they could see the young student, barely 15, holding a gun with trembling hands. "This is Officer Chen," her calm voice echoed through the library's PA system. "I know you're scared. We're here to help, not hurt you. Let's talk about this." Minutes felt like hours as Chen slowly built rapport with the student. Finally, the boy's voice cracked over the radio. "I just wanted them to stop bullying me. I didn't know what else to do." "I understand," Chen replied. "But this isn't the answer. Let me help you find a better way." Moments later, the student placed the gun on the floor and walked out with his hands up. As officers secured the scene, they discovered the gun was actually his father's, taken from home that morning. Back at the memorial ceremony, Wilson shared the news with the waiting crowd. Another potential tragedy averted, more lives saved, all because of protocols born from a mistake made on a rainy night. Later that evening, Sullivan and Wilson sat in their old conference room at the Department of Justice, where it had all begun. "You know," Wilson said, pouring them both coffee, "when you held that gun on me, I was angry. I thought it was just another example of everything wrong with policing." Sullivan nodded. "And I thought my career was over." Instead, Wilson smiled. "We both learned something valuable. Change doesn't come from pointing fingers or assigning blame. It comes from having the courage to learn from our mistakes." As they talked, reports were coming in from around the world. Departments using their protocols to resolve potentially deadly situations peacefully. What had started as one officer's mistake had grown into a global movement. Deputy Director Sullivan, Wilson said formally, "I'm retiring next month. The President wants me to recommend my replacement as head of the Federal Bureau of Police Reform." Sullivan looked up sharply. "Sir?" "You've earned it," Wilson said. "From that night in the rain to today's school incident, you've never stopped learning, never stopped improving. That's exactly what we need in this position." As Sullivan drove home that night, he passed the spot where he had pulled over Wilson's car 3 years ago. The rain was falling again, just like that night. But everything else had changed. His phone buzzed with a message from Chen. "The students' parents want to thank you for developing the protocols that saved their son's life today." Sullivan smiled, thinking about how a single mistake, handled with humility and a willingness to learn, had transformed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. As he looked toward the future, he knew their work wasn't finished, it was just beginning. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest mistakes lead to the most important changes. And sometimes, karma doesn't hit back, it helps you find a better way forward.